There are tons of urban legends surrounding Chernobyl, from a mutated spider that killed 3 people in an apartment building in the Ukraine, to the shadowy apparitions in abandoned buildings. These are unbelievable Chernobyl urban legends that might actually be true.
There are still crazy things going on in Chernobyl to this day, decades after the explosion of the reactor at the nuclear power plant in April 1986. Now, animals and nature have rightfully been affected in a big way. According to a study that began in 1991, the organisms responsible for decomposition and replenishing organic matter back into the ecosystem, such as insects, fungi, and microbes, are presenting symptoms of radioactive contamination, which isn't too shocking, but still isn't good. One of the most prominent areas of this effect has been called the Bloody Red Forest. It's a set of woodland where all the pine trees turned a blood red color right after the meltdown, and then died not long after. Now, it's pretty, don't get me wrong, but it's completely unnatural and has caused some issues. Now, 15 to 20 years after they were exposed to radiation and died, these trees were not decaying, when at this point, normal trees would be long gone. Due to this, scientists decided to run some tests by filling specially prepared garbage bags with leaf litter from uncontaminated areas, making sure there were no insects or decomposers present, and then leaving the bags out in both contaminated and uncontaminated wooded areas in the exclusion zone for nearly a year to check the decomposition rates of the leaves. Now, bags left in uncontaminated areas were as expected, with normal rates of decomposition between 70 to 90% of the leaves decomposing. But the leaves in contaminated areas retained 60% of their original weight, indicating much less activity by natural decomposers. Now, this suggests that the radiation exposure has a detrimental effect on the ability of the Chernobyl ecosystem to replenish itself with nutrients, which could be causing the stunting of tree growth that has been recorded. But with this comes another problem. The leaves in contaminated areas stayed intact and dry even after almost a year, and this could present a fire hazard, which in turn presents a danger of radioactive contaminants being spread outside the exclusion zone by forest fires. So that is scary and just not good at all. Then there's how this affected all the animals. According to a 2011 study in Biological Conservation, Chernobyl caused genetic mutations in plants and animals increased by a factor of 20. Among breeding birds in that region, rare species suffered disproportionate effects from the explosion's radiation compared to common species. Now, further research is needed to understand how the increased mutations affect species' reproductive rates, population size, genetic diversity, and other survival factors, but it definitely affected animals in a negative way. In 2016, a study found that the eastern tree frogs in the Chernobyl exclusion zone exhibited different characteristics than their neighboring cousins, and in 2023, another study discovered distinct genetic differences between Chernobyl dogs and dogs living only 10 miles away in Chernobyl City. Now, not all the animals living around Chernobyl are entirely wild, as there are around 900 stray dogs, mostly descended from those left behind when people evacuated the area. Veterinarians, radiation experts, and volunteers from a group called the Dogs of Chernobyl captured the dogs, vaccinated them against diseases, and tagged them. Now, in addition to the tags, some dogs are fitted with radiation detector collars. Now, the dogs offer a way to map radiation across the Chernobyl exclusion zone and study the ongoing effects of the accident. While scientists generally can't get a close look at individual wild animals in the zone, they can monitor the dogs closely, and they are, of course, radioactive. Visitors to the area are advised to avoid petting the dogs to minimize radiation exposure, no matter how cute they are. Now, these dogs have increased rates of cataracts because the eyes are the first tissues to show signs of chronic exposure to ionizing radiation. Now, not all is lost on these dogs though, as the unique genetic diversity of these dogs makes them ideal candidates for future studies, seeking to understand the long-term genetic health effects of highly radioactive environments on populations of large mammals, especially in understanding the biological underpinnings of human survival in regions of high and continuous environmental assault, the researchers said. So, I guess that's a plus.
Today we have the forest fires. The Chernobyl exclusion zone has witnessed several forest fires over the years, which have raised significant environmental and health concerns. These fires are particularly problematic because they can remobilize radioactive elements like cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium, which were deposited in the area following the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. When the vegetation in the exclusion zone, contaminated by these radioactive particles, burns, the smoke and ash can carry these particles over long distances, potentially spreading radiation beyond the immediate area of the fire. This phenomenon poses a considerable challenge for both environmental management and for public health. From an ecological standpoint, the redistribution of radioactive materials can affect a wide range of organisms, altering the mutation rates and impacting the health and stability of ecosystems in and around the exclusion zone. For human populations, especially those living in proximity to the exclusion zone, there is a risk of exposure to radioactive particles carried by smoke, which can have long-term health implications. The management of these fires, therefore, is not just a matter of controlling the blaze, but also involves monitoring and mitigating the spread of radioactivity, making it a very complex task for both firefighters and radiation safety experts. Next up, we have the new nuclear reactions. It's what nobody wants to hear in relation to Chernobyl. New nuclear reactions. Can't be good. The recent detection of increasing fission reactions in an inaccessible chamber of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant has raised significant concerns among scientists and safety experts. This chamber, which has remained sealed and unobserved by human or robotic means since the 1986 disaster, has shown a worrying surge in neutron emissions, a clear indicator of escalating nuclear fission activity. The primary concern for researchers is to figure out whether this escalation in nuclear activity will naturally diminish, or it will require a complex and hazardous intervention to avert a potential secondary nuclear incident. The situation is kind of similar to smoldering embers in a barbecue pit, a metaphor illustrating that while it doesn't pose an immediate explosive threat, it is an active problem that definitely requires ongoing supervision. The implications of this development are terrifying, as it highlights the long-term complexities and unpredictable nature of nuclear disaster aftermaths. This just goes to show how the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster continues to teach us and captivate us even decades later. Speaking of how Chernobyl continues to teach us more about the effects of nuclear disaster and radioactivity, next up on our list we have the radiation research. Ongoing research in the Chernobyl exclusion zone has significantly advanced our understanding of radiation's long-term ecological and biological impacts. Scientists have been studying the mutation rates in various species of flora and fauna within the zone, providing data on how radiation affects living organisms at the genetic level. These mutations, ranging from subtle genetic changes to visible deformities, offers insight into the mechanisms of radiation-induced damage. Researchers are also exploring how these genetic changes might affect population dynamics, species interactions, and overall ecosystem health. The area has become a unique natural laboratory for studying the ecological impacts of radiation, allowing scientists to observe the recovery processes in ecosystems subjected to high radiation levels. This research not only sheds light on the resilience and adaptability of nature, but also informs future strategies for managing contaminated environments and assessing the environmental risks associated with nuclear accidents. Next up, we have the very unfortunate psychological impacts of the disaster. Psychology issues resulting from widespread fear of radiological disease is a much greater issue, impacting many more people with lethal health effects. People who believe they or others have been impacted by radiological illnesses, erroneous or otherwise, exhibit greater issues with feelings of no control or fatalistic and pessimistic outlooks. This often leads to harmful behaviors, such as a lack of initiative to treat diseases. These fears are further strengthened by poor public understanding of the effects of radiation. Because of the radiation in Chernobyl, the people living there had to move, and it's been studied that these groups of people believed they had an illness related to radiation exposure more often than the citizens who actually remained inside of the contaminated regions. This brings into question the effectiveness of resettlement. Also, psychological distresses can significantly increase cancer mortality rates, possibly as much as 97%, nearly double, resulting in as many as approximately 100,000 additional cancer mortalities. From this accident, the fear of radiological illness has been way more prominent.
Starting us off in the number 10 spot is Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Beginning April 20th, 2010, the Gulf of Mexico was hit by the largest marine oil spill in history. This infamous oil spill, sometimes referred to as the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, all began with the Deepwater Horizon oil rig that was essentially a floating platform that was drilling an exploratory well about 18,000 feet deep. However, the disaster struck when the methane gas from the underwater well expanded, blasting through a recently installed concrete core and eventually rising into the drilling rig where it ignited and exploded. The explosion quickly engulfed the drilling platform, taking the lives of 11 workers and forcing the remaining 94 to evacuate, and after just 2 days, the entire rig had sunk. From that point forward, with every passing moment, oil was seeping into the ocean, causing complete environmental devastation. And although BP, the oil company, had attempted to halt the leak with remote-controlled underwater vehicles, the oil continued to flow for another 87 days. It's estimated that about 210 million gallons of oil were leaked from the underwater well, affecting nearly 70,000 square miles of ocean. This disaster not only wreaked environmental havoc, but also resulted in major criminal lawsuits for higher-ups in the company. Next up at number 9, Huascan avalanche. What's scary about earthquakes is not only how much damage they themselves can do depending on the magnitude, but what else they can cause depending on where it happens. And what happens when an earthquake happens near the highest mountain in Peru? Unfortunately, the deadliest landslide in the country's history. On May 31st, 1970, a 7.9 magnitude earthquake emanated from about 35 kilometers from Mount Huascan, tragically causing a massive landslide along the mountain. It's estimated that the avalanche sped down the mountain at about 160 kilometers an hour, picking up ice, rocks, and even a giant 700-ton boulder, along with other debris, eventually crashing down at the base of the mountain and burying the surrounding towns. The tragic day resulted in taking the lives of roughly 70,000 people and remains one of the worst disasters the country has faced. Coming in at number 8, Sichuan earthquake. Back in 2008, the mountainous region of Sichuan province in southwestern China faced one of the worst earthquakes in history. Caused by the collision of the Indian, Australian, and Eurasian plates, a huge 7.9 magnitude earthquake erupted, completely destroying roughly 80% of buildings in the affected area. The magnitude was astronomical. Not only did houses, businesses, and schools crumble to the ground, but entire villages and towns were destroyed from the disaster. Plus, if the devastation from that weren't enough, the quake caused multiple landslides, which created about 830 makeshift dams across the region, coincidentally causing widespread flooding, which was then only exacerbated by heavy rainfall. According to the final government assessment, nearly 90,000 people were counted as either dead, missing, or presumed dead. On top of that, an estimated 375,000 were left with serious injuries. But even those who survived the disaster, with or without injury, were greatly affected, as millions of citizens were now homeless, without food, and many without family. Coming in at number 7, mercury poison. In 1908, the Shiso Corporation opened its doors in Minamata City, Japan. For years, they were a fertilizer company, however, they eventually expanded to include chemical production, eventually becoming the most advanced in the country both before and after World War II. In 1932, the Shiso factory started acetaldehyde production, making 210 tons that year alone. And for over 30 years, between 1932 to 1968, the Shiso Corporation released their wastewater into the bay off Minamata City, not thinking anything of the environmental impact it could have on fisheries or their community. Now, I won't get into the chemistry too deep, but essentially a side reaction of creating this compound led to a very small percentage of methyl mercury, and this mercury was dumped into the bay along with the other wastewater, year after year after year. Over time, it infected the fish in the bay, which were then eaten by the public, and slowly but surely, the citizens of Minamata began contracting severe mercury poisoning. In 1956, the first victim of the disease was discovered, and after that, an epidemic of infection began. After all was said and done, there were roughly 3,000 certified victims of the poisoning, as well as another 10,000 who were compensated after several hefty lawsuits took place. So, although it may not have directly killed the most people, it caused an absolute pandemic, ruining the lives of thousands. Coming in at number 6, Mount Tambora eruption. Back in the year 1816, the world was faced with an incredibly strange occurrence. There was no summer. Countries all over the world, including tropical ones, were reporting incredibly low temperatures, and places like New York were facing snowstorms and frost in July. While at the time no one quite knew what happened, evidence has since suggested that it all had to do with an erupting volcano the year before. But of course, this was not just any earthquake. The legendary eruption occurred April 10th, 1815 at the Mount Tambora volcano in Indonesia, and remains the most powerful volcanic eruption in human history. According to NASA, 150 cubic kilometers of exploded rock flew into the air and would have been visible from about 1,300 kilometers away. But from this giant explosion came so much volcanic ash that it actually reduced the amount of sunlight that could reach the Earth's surface, and from there the temperature in the northern hemisphere dropped 1 degree Fahrenheit. Now, 1 degree might not sound like much, but it was enough to completely overhaul the climate for an entire year. Not only that, but the eruption itself caused roughly 11,000 deaths on site, followed by about 100,000 famine-related deaths for the following year due to crop shortages.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the reactor visit. This is a story that was told by a nuclear physicist from New York, Andrei Karsukov, and he told this story after he visited Chernobyl in 1997. During this visit, he went to the power station around 7:30 a.m. and he went into what was left of reactor number 4. This is where the explosion occurred. He began to take some radiation level readings, but suddenly he began to hear someone scream. He said, quote, "I ran upstairs to tell someone, but they said that when I entered the reactor control room, I was the first person to open that door in 3 years, and the only way to get inside the old reactor is through the doors I came in through. If someone had gone inside the reactor when I was not looking, they would have tripped an alarm that goes off when the reactor door is opened mechanically. The reactor door requires a password and a handprint, yet someone or something was inside." Later that evening, as we were eating dinner outside the building by the river next to the plant, a floodlight turned on in the room of the installation. There was no way anyone could be inside. As we ate, we figured there was a power surge or something. Then, just as my colleague said that, the light turned off. Maybe the reactor itself is now haunted by the souls who lost their lives as a result of the meltdown. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Chernobyl ghosts. While you can visit certain parts of Chernobyl today that have been deemed safe, taking a trip may not be for everyone, or perhaps it's too far, or whatever 100 reasons there are for not visiting the site. But with the technology we have now, there's another way you can visit the site, and that is through trusty old Google Maps. Many internet people have walked through the streets of the Exclusion zone, searching around, seeing what photos Google Maps holds. But with those virtual tours comes something that is absolutely terrifying people, and that is the apparent sightings of what is referred to as the ghosts of Chernobyl. People have reported seeing shadowy figures, sometimes even faces, in the abandoned buildings left in the exclusion zone, and I have to admit, some of the screenshots I've seen are pretty terrifying. Do you believe these are real ghosts caught on camera, or is it just a legend like many of the other things on today's list? In our number 8 spot today, we have the Blackbird. People in the district of the Ukraine that houses Chernobyl have told stories of sightings of the Blackbird for years, and it is perhaps the most well-known legend that comes from the area. The Blackbird is a human creature with wings and piercing red eyes, and it was apparently seen by workers at the Chernobyl plant on the fateful day of the nuclear disaster. disaster. After this, it was reported that anyone who had seen the bird would later report suffering from terrible nightmares and begin receiving threatening phone calls. Many of the people where the legend originates from, unfortunately, were at the center of the disaster and have since passed away from the radiation poisoning, so no one is sure if the Blackbird really is out there or not. The Blackbird is said to be a symbol of something terrible being afoot, so seeing it is definitely not a great thing to happen to a person. I think it's probably just another one to add to the list of reasons why maybe a Chernobyl visit isn't the best idea. I don't know, okay? It's for your health. In our number 7 spot today, we have the government cover-up. Of course, a disaster like this is going to get some government conspiracies swirling around it, and this little ditty suggests that the Chernobyl disaster was actually conducted by the Soviet government due to the failure of a new, at the time, huge missile defense radio structure called Duga-3. This structure, that actually exists in real life, is suspected of having been wildly over budget, and it was the source of many complaints after it was built. The systems were extremely powerful and broadcast in shortwave radio bands. They would appear without warning and sounded like a sharp, repetitive tapping noise, and they would disrupt things like legitimate broadcasts, amateur radio, commercial aviation communications, and utility transmissions, which all led to there being international complaints, and at the time, people didn't know what it was. This strange noise actually would go on to gain the tower the nickname Woodpecker for an idea of what the sound sounded like. Because of the fact that people didn't know where this sound was coming from, it led them to think that this signal was actually being used for things such as Soviet mind control or weather control experiments. So the story suggests that in order to eliminate it, the nearby Chernobyl facility was allowed to go into meltdown. It seems like they probably could have done something much less lethal and much less damaging, so I'm not exactly sure how true this one could possibly be, but there are definitely people out there who believe it. In our number 6 spot today, we have the spiders. The spiders that are residing within the exclusion zone are, of course, radioactive, but it's not only the spiders that are now dangerous to touch, it's also their webs. Spiders in Chernobyl are literally making radioactive webs, which is the stuff straight out of a comic book. These radioactive webs are also being woven in much different ways than they once were, which would suggest, of course, some sort of genetic mutation is at play. Spiders were already a creature I'd like to stay far away from. I feel just like tingly talking about them, but radioactive spiders adds a whole new level. Not only are the spiders now dangerous for non-radioactive animals to touch, but walking through their web is equally as dangerous to those who aren't thriving in the radiation. So not only do you have to watch out for regular old radioactive material, but now also get the never-ending construction of radioactive webs. That's amazing. It's so great.
And we're starting off with the abandoned amusement park. It kind of wasn't even abandoned, to be honest. It was set to open just days after the disaster, so it was never actually used. The rusted Ferris wheel and desolate bumper cars still stand though. It's definitely eerie, but somber too, an area frozen in time, a reminder of what could have been. The park, meant to be a source of entertainment for the residents of Pripyat and the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, now stands as a testament to the sudden and irreversible changes brought about by the events of that fateful day. The centerpiece of the park is the rusted Ferris wheel, which was meant to offer a nice panoramic view of the city, and surrounding it are the remains of bumper cars, a once colorful carousel, and the other amusement rides, all now deteriorating and covered in a layer of rust. And instead of the screams of happy visitors, there's just an eerie silence. Empty benches and picnic tables where families were meant to gather, completely desolate. Nature slowly reclaiming its territory as overgrown pathways and cracked the pavement, creating this sad, kind of post-apocalyptic ambience. If you are enjoying our channel, by the way, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We got videos coming at you on the daily. Number 9, the reactor control room. So deep within the bowels of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the reactor 4 control room still stands, a relic frozen in time. This once bustling control center was the nerve center where decisions and actions were taken on that night in 1986. It's said that as you step into the room, The air is heavy, the dust-covered dials and cracked screens are a reminder of the frantic attempts to bring the situation under control. The red radiation warning lights, frozen at levels that spell out the magnitude of the disaster. In the dim light, you can almost imagine the hum of machinery, the hurried footsteps, the urgent conversations that once filled the room, a complete contrast to the lifeless, ghostly atmosphere that it has now. Pripyat Hospital. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why the place is unsettling. Hospitals are depressing, even when fully open and operational. Abandoned hospitals are that. Plus, they have the creep factor of being empty and abandoned. So an abandoned hospital in the middle of a radioactive death zone, that's pretty much the apex of nightmarish hospitals right there. Looking at images of this place online, it looks like the real-life Silent Hill or something. Chipped paint, rusted beds, the building is literally falling apart and decaying. Really oozes with ambience, just not the kind of ambience you want to sit back and relax in. And at number 7, we have the Blackbird of Chernobyl. In the months preceding the catastrophic events of April 26, 1986, residents near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant reported encountering a grotesque creature, a mutated figure with gigantic wings and deep red eyes. Nightmares and direct confrontations with this winged anomaly, later dubbed the Blackbird of Chernobyl, haunted a number of residents of the area. And then there was the devastating explosion of Reactor 4 at 1:23 a.m. The ensuing fire and nuclear meltdown led to the evacuation of over 336,000 people, and the story goes that several survivors of this incident were counted witnessing a colossal blackbird with a 20-foot wingspan soaring through the sky. Even if you've never heard of this particular part of the Chernobyl lore, this story probably sounds kind of familiar. It's very similar to the Mothman sightings in West Virginia right before the Silver Bridge collapse in 1968. The physical description of the creature is similar, and the fact that these creatures were reported appearing right before disasters. Both the Blackbird of Chernobyl and the Mothman vanished after each of these catastrophes. So you can't help but wonder if these ominous creatures are bound to disaster, omens that materialize in the shadows preceding total destruction. Next on the list is the notorious Red Forest. So the Red Forest, named for the eerie reddish color assumed by the pine trees following the radioactive fallout, is a symbol of the environmental impact of the Chernobyl disaster. This dense woodland located near the nuclear power plant absorbed a significant amount of radioactive particles, resulting in the death of its vibrant flora. As you step into the Red Forest, the silence is apparently palpable. The once lush trees, now lifeless and devoid of foliage, stand as a testament to the irreversible consequences of the nuclear fallout. Scientists did this really interesting experiment here too to see how messed up things really were. They filled bags with leaves from clean spots and left them in both normal and messed up areas. So surprise, surprise, leaves in the messed up spots didn't break down much, holding on to about 60% of their weight. This means the radiation messed with the nature's ability to decompose and replenish itself in the area. The leaves stayed dry and intact for almost a year. Sounds harmless, but dry leaves in a place that's prone to forest fires, it's a ticking time bomb. If a fire breaks out, it could spread radioactive stuff beyond the no-go zone. So not only is the radiation messing with the forest's ability to bounce back, but now there's a legit risk of radioactive fire spreading trouble even farther. We've all heard the stories about mutated animals in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Turns out many of the animals do have odd mutations, but there's one urban legend about a mutated spider that takes things to a much more horrific level. After all, who would ever want to run into a mutated spider? Unless you thought you'd have a chance to turn out like Peter Parker, but that's not the case with this story. So a story about a killer mutant spider from Chernobyl was reported in a Turkish newspaper in 1990. Two residents of an apartment in the Ukraine had been found in the elevator having suffered extreme loss of BLOOD, but none of it was found at the scene. It looked like it had been sucked out of them. as there were also 2 puncture wounds on their necks. People started to whisper tales about vampires stalking the building, and some residents got so scared that they avoided using the elevators completely. Then 2 detectives investigated. On the 3rd day of their investigation, the detectives were riding the elevator when it came to an abrupt stop between the 5th and 6th floors. Then the lights went out. Now at first they weren't too worried. The elevator was known to be pretty janky at times, but when they started hearing an ominous clicking noise coming from above their heads, they froze. What was this? Was it the predator? They removed one of the roof panels and shone their flashlights, only to see a foot-long black shape moving towards them. Suddenly it was on top of one of the detectives. His partner fired at it. When backup arrived, they found the detective cowering in a corner, a mutated spider across from him. When police explored the rest of the elevator shaft, they found the thing had laid eggs, which they burnt to a crisp with flamethrowers. Many people believe these monstrous spiders were born out of the Chernobyl disaster caused by radiation exposure that altered their genes. Were aliens involved in the Chernobyl disaster? Well, there's a conspiracy that says they very well may have been, but not in the way you're probably thinking. Instead of being blamed for the meltdown itself, extraterrestrial beings are rumored to have actually helped prevent an even worse catastrophe. The theory goes that when the disaster happened, aliens may have intervened to help contain the situation. Now, what is this actually based on? Well, nothing. One eyewitness, Mikhail Varitsky, reported seeing a strange fiery ball of light hovering above the reactor during the night of the accident. He described it as a glowing orb that hung in the air for a few minutes. In his exact words, "I and other people from my team went to the site of the blast at night. We saw a ball of fire and it was slowly flying in the sky. I think the ball was 6 or 8 meters in diameter. Then we saw 2 rays of crimson light stretching towards the 4th unit. The object was some 300 meters from the reactor. The event lasted for about 3 minutes. The lights of the object went out and it flew away in the northwestern direction." End quote. Some people think this may have been an alien craft, and this wasn't the only sighting either. There had apparently been a number of UFO sightings in the sky in the days leading up to the accident, so were extraterrestrials helping to manage the radiation and prevent it from spreading uncontrollably? Did the Bible predict the Chernobyl disaster? Well, some interpret a passage from the book of Revelation to be pretty eerily accurate to the events. There's a passage that talks about a great star falling from the sky and poisoning the water, and that star is called wormwood. Well, in Russian, Chernobyl translates to wormwood, which has led many to think the Bible was somehow foreshadowing the disaster. The exact passage goes as follows: "And the 3rd angel sounded the trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, burning as it were a torch, and it fell on the 3rd part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood, and the 3rd part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter." Now, aside from the wormwood thing, there are other similarities here. Firefighters at Chernobyl described the fires at Reactor 4 as burning like a torch, just like in the scripture, and the part about bitter waters could definitely be interpreted as the radiation seeping into local water, making it unsafe to drink. There's even a sculpture near Chernobyl showing an angel with a trumpet, created by a Ukrainian artist as a tribute to the firefighters and workers who risked their lives during the crisis. Up next, we have the tale of the scream. So in 1997, a nuclear physicist named Andrei Korsakov from the University of Buffalo had an eerie experience at the Chernobyl power plant. While visiting the site of Reactor 4, he reported hearing a faint but frantic voice screaming for help as he was taking radiation readings in the infamous Ground Zero area at around 7:30 in the morning. Now, after hearing the screams, Korsakov rushed back upstairs to tell the personnel what he heard, but to his shock, they told him that he was the first person to enter that restricted area in 3 years. The security protocols were strict, too. Entry required a password, handprint scan, and any unauthorized presence would trigger a whole whackload of alarms. So, who had been screaming? In 1996, a researcher named Vitaly Pravitsev looked into the possibility of the accident having been caused by an earthquake. People were pretty skeptical though. Experts pointed out over 80 discrepancies in his report, but then in 1997, a group of scientists from the United Institute of the Physics of the Earth took another look into this. They found that on the night of April 25th, to the 26th, just 16 seconds before the reactor exploded, 3 nearby geological stations recorded a weak seismic event. So did an earthquake cause this disaster? And if so, was it natural, or was there a possibility that it was intentional? Sounds crazy, but the idea of weaponized earthquakes isn't entirely out of the realm of possibility. During the Cold War, there were rumors that both the Soviet Union and the US were researching tectonic weapons. We don't know for sure if these weapons were actually ever developed or used, but some think they may have been, of course, in secret. I mean, even Nikola Tesla claimed to have created a device in 1898 that could produce earthquake-like effects. An article in Pravda, the former Soviet newspaper, claimed in 1992 that geophysical weapons were indeed developed, but the government denied this. Another conspiracy has to do with the KGB. The idea is that they wanted to sabotage Reactor 4 to scare other countries away from building their own nuclear power plants. The goal? To monopolize Europe's energy market entirely. The thinking goes like this: if Chernobyl created massive fear about nuclear energy, countries in Western and Central Europe would maybe think twice before investing in their own nuclear facilities. With limited energy sources in Europe, the KGB figured that if they could make these countries dependent on Soviet oil and gas, they'd be in a position of power. Of course, if you're going to look at the KGB having something to do with the incident, it's only natural for others to speculate about the US government as well. Ever since the disaster took place in 1986, there were suspicions that the CIA might have had something to do with it, which is not surprising in the slightest. This one's pretty obvious. The idea is that the CIA orchestrated the explosion at Reactor 4 to create fear around nuclear energy and destabilize the USSR's influence. It was a tense period of time for the Soviets and the United States, and by creating a catastrophic event like this, the CIA could not only undermine the Soviet government's credibility, but also discourage other nations from developing nuclear power themselves, giving them the edge in the global energy market. Some were also highly skeptical of the rapid response of the US, thinking that they could have had a prior knowledge of the disaster. Now into more paranormal stuff. Like with any ghost town, especially one abandoned for such a tragic reason, ghost stories are plentiful. The amusement park has to be one of the eeriest spots in Pripyat. It was built just days before the disaster. It was meant to be a place of fun for families, but that never came to be. Sadly, it was never officially opened to the public, but legend has it that if you happen to be exploring Pripyat late at night, you may hear the faint sounds of laughter and music coming from the park. Visitors have reported strange occurrences while exploring. Some people say that when they approach the bumper cars, they can faintly hear the sounds of engines starting. Another creepy part about the park, and really the whole town itself, are the dolls scattered throughout it. Dolls that were left behind, now left to decay. Some believe that these dolls, especially those found in the carousel area, have taken on a life of their own. People have claimed that the dolls seem to change positions or appear in places they weren't before, but the giant rusted Ferris wheel is the most recognizable sight in the park. Some have said that when the wind blows, the wheel creaks and groans, sounding almost like whispers. It's not just the amusement park that's said to be haunted though. Urban explorers have reported seeing dark figures darting between buildings all throughout the city of Pripyat, especially in the empty schools and hospitals. Could these shadowy figures be the spirits of those who died in the disaster, still trapped in the abandoned city they once lived and worked in, forever doomed to roam the desolate streets? Some will say they've seen unexplained silhouettes peering out at them from corners of rooms or appearing just out of the corner of their eye. But are there actually shadowy entities trapped in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, or could people just be seeing things, either from psyching themselves out or having actual illusions brought on by the radioactivity? Now, the Blackbird of Chernobyl is probably the eeriest urban legend surrounding the Chernobyl disaster. The Blackbird of Chernobyl is a creepy urban legend that's come about in the years since the nuclear disaster in '86, but residents claimed to have seen the creature in the days leading up to it. It's often described as a big, dark figure, an enormous black owl or raven-looking thing. People claim to have spotted it flying around the Chernobyl power plant in the days leading up to the explosion. Not only that, but residents began having these horrific, vivid nightmares about it after spotting it. So what was this thing and why was it there? Well, the main theory is that the creature was an entity acting as a bad omen, a warning of the disaster to come, very similar to Mothman showing up in the Silver Bridge right before it collapsed. Some even think the Blackbird of Chernobyl and Mothman are the exact same creature. So what do you all think? And at our number 5 spot, we have the piles of gas masks. So famously, there's one specific room in one of the schools in Pripyat where the floor is filled with gas masks. Looters had come in and taken the small amounts of silver in the mask filters. The presence of gas masks is obviously not a good sign. Doesn't make for a very happy sight. Looks more like the apocalypse hit, which is probably what it felt like for the residents of the city that day, especially the youngsters. They must have been scared out of their minds. What's also odd is that these gas masks weren't used. You'd think they would have been. Apparently just a week before the incident, students were trained on how to use them in case of an emergency, but after the incident took place and everyone was being evacuated, people were instructed not to use the masks because the Communist Party leadership thought the use of them would cause people to panic. Basically, they wanted to save face and not blow the issue out of proportion. You know, the worst nuclear disaster in history. Next up, we have the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone sign. This sign is straightforward, yet crucial. Placed at the boundaries of the zone, it's a worn-out marker, weathered by time, warning anyone who approaches. The sign features the distinct trefoil radiation symbol, an unmistakable sign of the danger that lies beyond, marking the edge between safety and risk. The sign is surrounded by rusted gates and crumbling walls, signifying the transition from the familiar to the forbidden, signaling the presence of invisible threats from the nuclear catastrophe that took place back in '86. The exclusion zone sign is a tangible reminder that the invisible dangers of radiation are still very much present. It marks a boundary that, if crossed without caution, could lead to exposure to radioactive contaminants. It's a no-nonsense marker in a place where the consequences of nuclear disaster are still very real, but people jump over all the time, apparently, like graffiti and stuff inside the area. That I wouldn't do it personally, but hey, live your lives. Next on the list are the Chernobyl Pripyat river boats. Eerie as hell. So these boats were once the lifeblood of Pripyat, but when the reactor went kaboom in '86, everything changed. The whole area got evacuated, leaving these boats stranded and forgotten. Rusted metal, broken windows, and a thick layer of dust. These boats haven't moved in decades, just sitting there like ghost ships on a stagnant river. Nature's creeping in, moss, weeds, and who knows what else. The radiation factor amps up the creepiness. These boats were exposed to the fallout, soaking it up like a sponge. No creaking of the boat against the dock, no hum of engines, just eerie stillness. Then there's the knowledge that Pripyat was a lively place once. Families lived there, kids played by the river. Now it's just a desolate wasteland. Number 2, the dolls. Within the deserted kindergarten of Pripyat, the floor is scattered with the haunting remnants of childhood abandoned dolls left behind by evacuated youngsters. Their lifeless eyes stare into the emptiness of a room that once echoed with laughter and play. The dolls, which are now weathered and disheveled, sit frozen in time. Some left in the exact same places where they were left in the middle of play all those years back. And what makes the presence of these dolls so somber is that the residents were told that the evacuation was going to be temporary. So in this abrupt evacuation, children left these toys behind thinking they'd be back soon to get them. But of course, as we all know, they never returned. One of the saddest displays is a set of 4 dolls positioned for a tea party, left sitting in place ever since that fateful day in '86. And we gotta finish things off with all the icky animal mutations. Now, this is actually true. This is not in the realm of cryptozoology. There have been animals found within the area that have some unusual mutations. You have rodents with peculiar physical deformities, ranging from extra limbs to abnormal growths. In some cases, the effects extend to changes in the color of their fur. Birds have also shown signs of the radiation's influence. Some have beak malformations, and even their mating practices have been shown to be off. And you can only imagine how messed up some of the fish are in the Pripyat River. Fish have abnormalities like altered spinal structures and asymmetrical body growth because they're living in radioactive water. What's kind of interesting though is that, sure, there are a bunch of mutations, but the exclusion zone has kind of become a haven for some wildlife because there's no human interference, or at least very, very little. So some species have thrived in this absence of human activity. Nature is incredibly resilient.
In our number 5 spot today, we have the alien invasion. Okay, it seems absolutely insane, but there is an alien conspiracy that actually revolves around Chernobyl, and there are people who believe it's true. There is part of this theory that I like, and that is because it basically suggests that aliens saved humanity. Yeah, in this story, they didn't cause disaster or try to steal our planet, and instead, they saved us from a complete and total meltdown. What happened, and how this all started, is that around the same time of the Chernobyl disaster, people reported spotting a number of UFOs. One witness even said that they saw a UFO for 6 hours. So basically, because of this uptick in sightings, people believe that the aliens came to help sort of diffuse some of the radiation levels that were seen after the disaster. This would have helped to prevent an even larger blast with an even higher amount of death and illness. This is sort of a conspiracy brought up to explain how, while this meltdown was of course catastrophic, it didn't leave like apocalyptic level damage, which believers of this theory said there should have been. So what do we think? Did aliens come to save the planet? In our number 4 spot today, we have The Musician. This is a story that comes from a Redditor named Jake, but this actually isn't Jake's story. This is the story of a man named Yuri who Jake met at a bar in Finland. Yuri is actually a Chernobyl survivor, and he had quite the harrowing tale to share with Jake. Yuri is a musician, and at the time of the disaster, he was in a state-sponsored musical dance troupe. Basically, as soon as the disaster happened, this group was called upon by the government to come in and calm the people living in the area. Yuri said, quote, "Mere hours after the meltdown commenced, our bus entered the exclusion zone at checkpoint Dyatki. We were told not anything, and the soldiers made it forbidden for speaking with the village people. Imagine not knowing a disaster taking place, yet seeing the strange workings of the radioactivity all around. Everyone was sick and dying, yet quarantined and not allowed to leave the zone." This is all chilling, but this is where the story takes a terrifying turn. He begins to describe their final performance, which was in Pripyat. The ballerina danced, knowing something horrible had happened, and she danced like never before, and she even let her hair down from her bun to just let it flow. Suddenly though, Yuri noticed that these locks of hair weren't just falling out of her bun, they were falling down to the ground. Basically, Yuri ends off his story by explaining his escape, which was through back roads and avoiding military checkpoints, and he ends off by saying that he is the only one of his group to survive. In our number 3 spot today, we have barn swallows. Any animal who lives in the exclusion zone has to have been affected by the disaster, and that includes those who spend most of their time in the sky. I'm obviously talking about birds. The barn swallows in Chernobyl are one animal who have seen a change in their physical appearance that has lasted all of the years since the nuclear meltdown. It is unclear why these birds have been affected greater than their land animal counterparts, or if these changes will ever reverse to their previous state, but here's what they are currently dealing with. The swallows appeared to have severely deformed beaks, disproportionate feathers, some had partial albinism, and they were seen to have had much smaller brains. Of course, some of these issues are much worse than others, and I'm sure these changes have significantly affected their ways of life, but of course, they continue to adapt as time goes on. It is sad that this human-made disaster has affected them in such a negative way, but the fact that they are still around really shows their adaptability and their resilience. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Chernobyl zombies. This little legend that comes from within the exclusion zone claims that after the Chernobyl disaster, we of course know that unfortunately people lost their lives, but what happened if those who did then became the undead? We're obviously talking about zombies here. There are plenty of legends that suggest the exclusion zone isn't dangerous and off limits because of the toxic radiation, but actually because there are brain-eating zombies wandering the area. I mean, I personally have never received a lethal dose of radiation, so I cannot confirm nor deny that this would turn one into a zombie, but I'm gonna go ahead and call this one most likely fake. I mean, at least I am really hoping it is. We're dealing with enough as a society. We don't need zombies on the list. This little legend can most likely be attributed to a video game that takes place in the exclusion zone, but it certainly is not based on any real life facts, at least that we know of. Finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have the Stalkers. Speaking of that video game, which is called Stalker, it might have inspired the tales of the zombies, but it also apparently has inspired some to try and sneak into the exclusion zone themselves. This popular game set in the zone has made some people try and sneak into it themselves in real life in order to live out the game. You know, like a LARPing scenario, but the only enemy this time is radiation. Basically, there are these people who are now being referred to as stalkers, and they are said to be sort of romanticizing the exclusion zone. They like to sneak in, explore the ruins, sleep in the abandoned buildings, and sometimes even bring in a device to show them how much radiation they're being exposed to, which is pretty frightening. Despite these dangerous explorers sharing their nickname with the video game, however, the name actually comes from characters in the novel Roadside Picnic, which was turned into a classic Soviet film entitled Stalker, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky. The term stalker is meant to refer to thieves who sneak into places that are harboring lethal secrets. Some even tried to tempt fate even more by doing things like eating fruit that they found growing in the zone. Because of the fact that this place is meant to be off limits, many of those sneaking in here who consider themselves stalkers wear things like paramilitary gear, they wear gas masks, balaclavas, and other things to cover their face. All in all, it's very dangerous and also very unsettling.
Coming in at number 5, the Great Galveston Hurricane. Once upon a time, the small island of Galveston, just off the coast of Texas, was the grandest city in the entire state. It had the biggest port, the most wealth, swanky mansions, and even some of the first telephones and electric lights. However, after one fateful storm on September 8th, 1900, the small island city would never be the same. The day began like any other, and although they had received limited news about a storm brewing near the Gulf of Mexico, they didn't think too much of it. Then around 11 a.m. they received a report that the storm was getting worse and the waters were very rough. But still, without the technology we have now, there was no way of knowing what was coming. Finally, around 3 p.m., 2 men ran into town from the beach shouting that the Gulf was looking like a 50-foot tall wall and something bad was headed straight for the island. Shortly after, the storm hit Galveston, the hurricane sweeping in at a whopping 225 kilometers an hour, paired with 6-foot waves crashing into buildings, sweeping away citizens, animals, and everything in sight. According to those who survived the fateful day, the storm went on for hours, not subsiding until the early hours of the next morning, just in time to see the wreckage in broad daylight. The carnage was insurmountable. Not only were roughly 3,600 houses and 600 businesses reduced to nothing but rubble, leaving thousands of citizens without shelter, but between 6,000 to 8,000 people perished during the disaster as well. Their bodies left mangled in the streets for their loved ones to try and identify. To this day, it remains the worst hurricane in US history. Coming in at number 4, the Indian Ocean tsunami. Almost 20 years ago, on December 26, 2004, a catastrophic magnitude 9.1 earthquake struck the undersea off the west coast of Sumatra, Indonesia. Now, as far as earthquakes go, that is almost as bad as it gets. In fact, since 1900, this event is considered the 3rd largest earthquake worldwide. From the time the quake began at 8 a.m. in Indonesia, there was only about 15 minutes before the speeding waves hit land, giving residents very little time to flee to higher ground and try and save themselves or their family. The deadly waves then continued for another 7 hours, devastating not only the nearby coastal areas, but even managed to reach as far as East Africa. Waves of up to 100 feet were crashing down, traveling as fast as 800 kilometers an hour and swallowing everything in its path. The final estimated death toll was 230,000. However, another 2 million people in 14 different South Asian countries, as well as some East African countries, were left completely displaced. To date, this tsunami has taken the lives of more people than any other recorded tsunami in history. Coming in at number 3, the Bola cyclone. On November 12, 1970, an unexpected and deadly storm struck what was at the time called East Pakistan, now known as the region of Bangladesh. The Bola cyclone formed over the Bay of Bengal from the remnants of Tropical Storm Nora. And Nora had spent 2 days over the South China Sea before beginning to intensify and move north towards East Pakistan. Before the storm arrived on land, the surrounding areas were inundated with flooding. Then on the day, the cyclone struck India and Bangladesh with wind speeds of around 185 kilometers an hour, absolutely decimating everything in its path. And tragically, either due to the lack of notice from the Indian Weather Service or not enough understanding of the cyclone's intensity, a proper evacuation plan was not put in place, and around 500,000 lives were lost to the disaster. However, as you can imagine, the issues didn't stop there. In the aftermath of the tragedy, there was a lot of back and forth and blame placed for not providing proper preparations, many criticizing the government's slow response to the aftermath. Then later that year, as a kind of revolt against the current government, a new opposition party ended up winning in general elections in East Pakistan, something that was completely ignored by West Pakistan. And ultimately, this led to the Bangladesh Liberation War in 1971 and the creation as an independent nation in 1972. Coming in at number 2, the Yellow River floods. The second largest river that runs through China is the Huanghe River, or the Yellow River, and there have been 3 major floods recorded that collectively are considered to be the worst floods in history, as well as some of the most destructive natural disasters ever recorded. The first happened in 1887 when the strategically placed dikes and dams filled with silt, gradually raising the water levels near the lowlands. Then, after a heavy rainfall, the river began to overflow and quickly resulted in the death of somewhere between 900,000 and 2 million citizens, as well as causing mass famine and homelessness across the surrounding areas. Then, several years later, in 1931, the river flooded again. This time, about 88,000 square kilometers of land became completely immersed in water, leaving 80 million people without their homes and killing an estimated 4 million. However, although the second is recorded as the worst flood, the most tragic was the last of these floods in 1938. Between 1937 to 1945, China and Japan were at war with each other in what is now referred to as the Sino-Japanese War. I won't get into all the nitty-gritty details, but essentially during this time, the Chinese were in a full-on resistance against the Japanese, who were attempting to advance their influence in the territory. And unlike the first two, the 1938 flood was intentional. Due to the advancements of the invading Japanese troops during the war, Chinese nationalists, under the force of their leader Chiang Kai-shek, destroyed the productive dams and dikes holding the river at bay, thus causing another catastrophic flood. The 1938 flood killed between 500,000 to 900,000 people, some of whom were soldiers, but many of which were their own civilians. Pretty much anyone that did survive was left as a refugee, their farmlands and homes destroyed by the flood, and resulted in an overall anger and distrust towards their government that took decades to heal. And last up today in our number 1 spot, the Bhopal disaster. On December 3rd, 1984, the city of Bhopal, India was overrun by a catastrophic 45-ton gas leak from the Union Carbide insecticide plant. The leak began in the early hours of the morning, around midnight or so, and was only made worse when the public siren was shut off around 1:30 so as not to alarm the citizens over what, at the time, was believed to be an insignificant leak. To top it off, there was little to no communication between the plant, the Bhopal authorities, and the hospital workers, so no one was properly prepared when things got really bad. A mere hour and a half later, the public siren began wailing, this time for real, as it became evident that there was indeed a huge problem. Many were still asleep as it was around 3 in the morning, and so once the deadly gas reached the nearby towns, more than 3,000 citizens died instantly. However, the tragedy did not end there. The death toll continued to rise, climbing up to nearly 20,000 victims, and another 500,000 faced injuries such as respiratory failures and blindness. Even worse is that after the initial incident, the leak was reported not to have been dealt with properly, and so 300 metric tons of waste remained at the site for decades, contaminating drinking water and causing widespread chronic health problems, birth defects, and fertility issues for citizens until as recently as 2016. On a good note, as of 2004, the government is required to provide clean water to the residents due to the contamination in the groundwater, and in 2010, 7 former employees of the plant were convicted of negligence related to the incident. But nothing will ever change the fact that a gas leak was hidden from the public and killed thousands in their sleep.
Around our halfway mark today, we have the decaying of nature. Since the Chernobyl disaster, scientists have realized something very strange with the plants in the exclusion zone. They have realized that the dead trees, plants, and leaves at the contaminated site don't decay at nearly the same rate as plants elsewhere. This is definitely weird. I mean, just thinking about it, I would have thought that the opposite would be true, that plants in the exclusion zone would decay even faster, but this is why it's good that I am not a scientist. Tim Mosow, a professor of biology at the University of South Carolina, has said, quote, "We were stepping over all these dead trees on the ground that had been killed by the initial blast. Years later, these tree trunks were in pretty good shape. If a tree had fallen in my backyard, it would be sawdust in 10 years or so." To find out what was happening, or more accurately, what wasn't happening, the research team collected hundreds of samples of leaf litter from forest floors that were not contaminated by radiation and stuffed the leaves into bags lined with pantyhose. This was to keep out insects. They then distributed these bags around the Chernobyl area and waited 9 months. The results were shocking. Samples of leaf litter that were placed in highly contaminated areas showed 40% less decomposition than samples that were placed in uncontaminated sites. The degree of decay was proportional to the degree of radioactive contamination at each site, according to the study. Now that really is just interesting. Next up on our list, we have the Sweden effect. I'm sure you might be wondering what Sweden could possibly have to do with Chernobyl, but don't fret, I'm here to tell you. The radioactive cloud from Chernobyl rode the wind over to Sweden and spit out in the form of rain. As teardrops? Somebody's really crying. As raindrops landed, so did radiation, especially in parts of north and central Sweden. Keeping food from getting contaminated was an issue in some places. Northern Sweden absorbed a whole 5% of the radioactive cesium-137 that Chernobyl released into the air. Atoms of it wound up in the lichen that reindeer graze on. That same year, after the farmers' meat harvesting season, it was discovered that almost 80% of the Swedish reindeer meat was too contaminated for sale. 80%! That's so much! Reindeer farmers had to change their practices, harvesting their meat earlier in the year before the animals had a chance to eat the contaminated moss. Because of this contamination, the Swedish authorities actually ended up raising the limit for permissible radiation in game, freshwater fish, wild berries, and mushrooms, based on their view that these foods made up only a little bit of the Swedish diet. Even to this day, a small portion of reindeer can't be sold because they have too much of the radioactive element. Moving on down our list, we have the new safe confinement, also known as the NSC. This structure at Chernobyl represents a monumental advancement in nuclear containment technology. This massive structure, completed and put into place in 2016, was designed to address the critical need to secure the remains of the reactor that was destroyed in the 1986 disaster. The NSC is a feat of engineering, designed to last at least 100 years and to withstand extreme weather conditions. Its primary purpose is to prevent the escape of radioactive material from the original sarcophagus, which was hastily constructed following the accident and had since deteriorated. Additionally, the NSC provides a controlled environment for the deconstruction of the reactor and the management of radioactive waste, effectively reducing the risk of further radiation leakage into the environment, which I think we can all breathe a sigh of relief for. This structure is not only a shield against the radiation, but also serves as a symbol of international cooperation, as its construction involved experts and funding from around the world. The NSC's completion marked a significant step forward in the long-term effort to contain the Chernobyl disaster's legacy and mitigate its environmental impact. Moving on our list, we have the mysterious fungi. Fungi is definitely one of the weirdest things we have on our planet. Not sure if you guys guys have seen that documentary, Fantastic Fungi, that thing absolutely blew my mind. It's kind of creepy, but also truly incredible. This isn't just a love letter to mushrooms. I do have a point I'm trying to make here, and that point would be the discovery of radiotrophic fungi in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, which presents a remarkable example of life's adaptability to extreme environments. These fungi have developed a unique mechanism to harness radiation for growth. They utilize melanin, a pigment found in their cell walls, to convert gamma radiation into chemical energy. This process is somewhat similar to photosynthesis, where plants use chlorophyll to convert sunlight into energy. We all struggled to say that word in elementary school when we learned about it, but in this case, instead of sunlight, the fungi are using radiation as their energy source. This discovery opens new avenues for research in the fields of biology, ecology, and biotechnology. From a biological standpoint, it provides insights into how organisms adapt to and thrive in hostile environments, which could be crucial for understanding life in extreme conditions on Earth, and potentially other planets too. In terms of practical applications, these radiotrophic fungi could be used in bioremediation to clean up radioactive waste or environments contaminated by nuclear accidents. The fungi are fantastic, what can I say? Next up on our list we have the government cover-up theory. What's a good list without a little government conspiracy, you know what I mean? After the release of the incredible HBO show Chernobyl, which if you haven't seen it, it is a must watch. I'm looking at you, Taylor. Truly such a good show, very unsettling. After the show's release, the Russian government released a statement saying that the show was actually anti-Soviet Union propaganda and that they would be releasing their own Chernobyl show, which would detail how the CIA was actually the cause for the original nuclear disaster. Rumor has it that the CIA sabotaged something which caused the reactor to melt down, and the whole thing was actually America's fault. I have no way of either proving or disproving this theory or legend, but I think it's probably safe to say that someone here isn't telling the truth. I'll let you decide for yourself. And finally, rounding out our list today, we have the alien cleanup. Okay, just one more bizarre theory. There's always gotta be an alien story to keep things interesting and to add to the list of questions we have for extraterrestrials when we hopefully eventually find them. Rather than the aliens causing the disaster, which might be where your mind went, instead this legend suggests that they helped in the aftermath. Apparently, some people out there think that the Chernobyl disaster wasn't as bad as it should have been. I don't think they mean it in as bad of a way as that sounds, but rather that they are surprised that the amount of people who passed in the disaster wasn't higher considering how bad the whole ordeal actually was. This, coupled with an apparent eyewitness account from a man named Mikhail Veritsky, who claimed he saw a fiery ball of light hovering for a few minutes above the exposed reactor on the night of the incident, has led people to speculate that maybe our friendly alien neighbors swooped down in the nick of time to help clean up the mess that was made. Apparently, this ball of light was also seen on September 16th, 1989, when there was more radiation leaking from the unit at Chernobyl, which some claim was the aliens containing the radiation. Honestly, I'd like to think that this one is true, because what a nice thing for the aliens to do. They probably have their own nuclear weapons, so they certainly didn't need ours, and we really did not have the tools to clean it up, so I can definitely appreciate the fact that they were willing to lend a helping hand. Alright?
Then there's the birds. While there are plenty of them in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, 489 different species to be exact, they are examples of animals that still face problems from radiation exposure. A study of barn swallows from 1991 to 2006 indicated birds in the exclusion zone displayed more abnormalities than birds from a controlled sample, including deformed beaks, albinistic feathers, bent tail feathers, and deformed air sacs. Now, birds in the zone had less reproductive success, and these birds often had smaller brains, malformed sperm, and cataracts, presumably as a result of radiation-related genetic mutations. Now, if you are already scared of spiders, these ones will freak you out even more. The spiders here are radioactive as they build their webs to catch their prey. They add to the dangerous environment of the forest. These webs are not like normal spider webs. In fact, they are woven in abstract ways that suggest genetic mutation is at hand. Now, they're also highly radioactive themselves, making them a danger for any non-radioactive animal to touch. Now, who knew spiders could get 100 times scarier? But that's not the only scary mutated animal there. According to Slate in the early 90s, which was just a few years after the incident, radiation levels in the wild boar that died near Chernobyl were more than 2,000 times what's considered safe. And even today, eating animals from inside the exclusion zone is still pretty hazardous, as a person might be exposed to radiation levels that are dozens of times higher than what's safe. Then in 2016, a video went viral of a catfish swimming around the cooling pond of the Chernobyl power plant. Very few mutations lead to extra large size, explains University of South Carolina radiation specialist Dr. Timothy Masu. Instead, they grow less efficiently, they're less capable of catching food, and they tend to not live as long. Now that's why it's shocking that it's so large, and I would not want to mess with the fish that big. Then, as of 2015, there had been almost 20,000 cases of thyroid cancer reported in people who were exposed at the time of the incident. And approximately 5,000 of these thyroid cancers are likely attributed to them drinking fresh milk containing radioactive iodine from cows that had eaten contaminated grass in the first few weeks following the incident. Yep, you heard that right. The cows created radioactive milk. Now in 2018, it was said that Ukraine still has radioactivity levels up to 5 times the official safe limit, research suggests. Now scientists sampled cow's milk from private farms and homes in the Ravine region, about 125 miles away from the site of the catastrophic explosion. Researchers found levels of radioactive caesium in milk above Ukraine's safe limit for adults of 100 becquerel per liter at 6 of 14 settlements studied. Now the highest levels found were about 500 BQ liter, 5 times over the limit for adults, and more than 12 times that for the young. The study was carried out at the University of Exeter and the Ukrainian Institute of Agricultural Radiology. More than 30 years after the Chernobyl disaster, people are still routinely exposed to radioactive caesium when consuming locally produced staple foods, including milk, in Chernobyl-affected areas in Ukraine, said Dr. Irina Lebunska of University of Exeter. Though the level of soil contamination in the studied areas is not extremely high, radioactive caesium continues to accumulate in milk and other foods. Now this is just one of the lasting effects, which is horrific. On a lighter note though, an endangered wild horse is making a comeback thanks to Chernobyl. The Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute called the Przewalski's horses the last truly wild horse. Its once large population that ranged across large areas of Asia and Europe was eventually reduced to almost nothing. When Lee Boyd and Catherine A. Hope edited a book about the animal in 1994, the most recent wild sighting had occurred in the late 60s, leading the authors to declare them extinct in the wild. But British ecologists Mike Wood and Nick Beresford, who specialize in studying the effects of radiation on Chernobyl's wildlife, observed that the Przewalski's horses is thriving within the exclusion zone. In the late 1990s, about 30 of these horses were released in the Ukrainian side of the zone, and the population has increased to more than 200. Based on camera trap images, Wood estimated that some of the original horses, identified by their brand markings, are still alive, and photos of juvenile horses also indicate that the population is expanding. And finally, if you didn't know, Earth has both a magnetic field and an atmosphere that protects us from dangerous radiation. Now NASA knows that astronauts on the International Space Station get exposed to 20 times the radiation we get down here on the planet. So after discovering that a fungus thriving around the heavily radiated Chernobyl disaster site consumes radiation through radiosynthesis, they decided to experiment with it in space, and over the course of a month they found out that the fungus actually blocks radiation literally by eating it. The experiments on the ISS revealed that it was utilizing melanin to transform radioactive gamma rays into chemical energy. Now this is actually really exciting because this ability may turn out to be useful in future space exploration. NASA is hoping that the fungus may be used to both shield equipment and the crew from deadly radiation during long space flights, and even more importantly, help clean up radioactive waste. Well, that's all for our list of unsettling creatures found in Chernobyl that won't stop growing. Now, what on our list shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. I'm your host, Emily, and we'll see you next time. Peace.
Want to see more videos like this one? Check out this video next. This video is about real encounters with demons from the Bible that will leave you shaking from head to toe. Are you too scared to check it out? Click the video now. Viewer discretion is heavily advised.